In the western neighborhoods of Detroit, Michigan, where old brick houses stood beside quiet streets and maple trees lined the sidewalks, there was a small church called St. Gabriel's. The church had been there for nearly 80 years. Once it had been full every Sunday. Families packed the wooden pews, children ran across the courtyard, and the church bells rang loudly across the neighborhood. But time had changed the city. Factories had closed, families moved away, and many of the houses nearby stood quiet now. The church still opened every morning, but only a few people came inside to pray. Behind the church stood a small garden courtyard. It was surrounded by a low iron fence and filled with simple flowers, white lilies, red roses, and small bushes that struggled through the cold Detroit winters. In the center of the garden stood a statue of the Virgin Mary carved from pale stone. The statue wasn't large or expensive. It had been donated decades earlier by a factory worker named Joseph Mancini after his daughter recovered from a serious illness. Since then, the statue had stood quietly in the garden, its gentle face looking down over the flowers and the people who came there to pray. One of the people who visited the garden most often was Father Michael Donnelly. Father Michael had been the priest of St. Gabriel's for almost 20 years. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to notice when someone was struggling. Every morning, he walked through the garden before opening the church doors. He would stop beside the statue, bow his head for a moment, and whisper a short prayer. On a cold morning in early October, something unusual happened. Father Michael stepped outside just after sunrise. The air was crisp and the sky above Detroit was pale blue. Fallen leaves covered the garden path as he walked slowly toward the statue. At first, everything seemed normal. Then he noticed someone sitting on the wooden bench beside the flowers. It was an elderly man wrapped in a worn coat. Father Michael approached gently. "Good morning," he said. The man looked up slowly. His face was pale, and his breathing sounded heavy. "My name is Samuel Carter," the man said quietly. "I heard people come here to pray." Father Michael nodded. "They do." Samuel pointed weakly toward the statue. "They say Mary helps the sick." The priest hesitated for a moment. Samuel explained that he had been fighting lung disease for several years. The doctors had told him the illness would only grow worse. Recently, the pain had become almost constant. "I didn't know where else to go," Samuel admitted. Father Michael placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder. "You're welcome here," he said. Samuel slowly stood and walked toward the statue. He knelt beside the flower bed, resting one hand on the cold stone base. For several minutes, he said nothing. The only sound in the garden was the wind moving softly through the trees. Then Samuel closed his eyes. "Mary," he whispered, "I'm tired." Father Michael stood quietly nearby, allowing the moment to remain private. But after several minutes, Samuel did something unexpected. He slowly stood up again. His breathing sounded calmer. He looked surprised. "The pain," he murmured. Father Michael stepped closer. "What about it?" Samuel touched his chest carefully. "It's not gone," he said. "But it's lighter." The priest didn't know what to say. Samuel smiled faintly. "Maybe it's just the fresh air." Father Michael nodded gently. "Maybe." Samuel thanked him and walked slowly toward the gate before disappearing down the quiet Detroit street. The priest remained in the garden for a long time afterward. He looked at the statue of the Virgin Mary standing among the lilies. The stone face seemed exactly as it always had. Calm, peaceful, watching over the garden. Father Michael shook his head slightly. Perhaps Samuel was simply feeling better for the moment. Perhaps it was coincidence. But neither of them knew that this small moment would soon become the beginning of something far bigger. Because within a few weeks, people across Detroit would begin coming to St. Gabriel's garden. Many of them would be sick. Many would be desperate. And many of them would say the same thing Samuel Carter had whispered that morning. They believed the Virgin Mary of Detroit was helping them heal. The first few days after Samuel Carter visited the garden, life at St. Gabriel's Church in Detroit continued as it always had. Father Michael opened the church each morning, swept the stone steps, and watered the flowers around the statue of the Virgin Mary in the courtyard garden. The autumn air grew colder each day, and orange leaves gathered along the fence beside the narrow path leading to the statue. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Then, one afternoon, someone knocked on the church door. When Father Michael opened it, a young woman stood outside holding the arm of an older lady. "My mother is very sick," the woman said softly. "Someone told us there's a statue of Mary here where people pray." Father Michael hesitated. He remembered Samuel Carter, but he had never told anyone about that morning. "Of course," he said kindly. "You're welcome to visit the garden." The two women slowly walked through the church hallway and out into the courtyard. The older woman, Margaret Wilson, had been suffering from severe arthritis for years. Even walking a few steps caused her visible pain. Her daughter helped her sit on the wooden bench beside the flower bed. Margaret stared quietly at the statue. The pale stone figure stood among the lilies, just as it had for decades. Nothing about it looked unusual. After a few minutes, Margaret slowly stood up. With difficulty, she walked toward the statue and placed her hand on the base. She closed her eyes. "I don't need a miracle," she whispered. "I just need strength." The garden was silent except for the wind rustling the dry leaves. When Margaret opened her eyes again, she remained still for a moment. Then she took a few steps backward. Her daughter watched closely. "Mom," she asked. Margaret moved her fingers carefully. The pain in her hands seemed different. Not gone, but calmer. She looked at her daughter with quiet surprise. "It feels easier." Father Michael watched from the edge of the courtyard. He felt a strange mixture of hope and caution. Perhaps the peaceful garden simply helped people relax. Perhaps prayer gave them strength. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that something unusual seemed to be happening. Within days, more visitors began arriving. An elderly veteran who struggled to walk after a stroke. A woman fighting cancer who came wrapped in a thick blanket. A young man whose doctors had told him his heart was weak. Most of them came quietly. They sat on the bench. They prayed. Some touched the stone base of the statue. And many of them said the same thing before leaving. They felt lighter. Sometimes the pain eased. Sometimes their breathing improved. Sometimes they simply felt peace they had not felt in years. Word began spreading slowly through the surrounding neighborhoods. People started calling the statue the Virgin Mary of Detroit. At first, Father Michael felt uncomfortable with the attention. He reminded visitors that prayer does not always mean healing. But something about the garden was clearly drawing people in. One evening, as the sun began setting behind the Detroit skyline, Father Michael stepped into the courtyard again. Several visitors were sitting quietly on the benches. A man in a wheelchair. Two elderly women praying softly. A young mother holding a child wrapped in a blanket. The garden had never been this full before. Father Michael looked at the statue. The stone face remained calm and gentle in the golden light. Suddenly, he noticed something strange. For a brief moment, sunlight reflected across the statue's cheek in a way he had never seen before. It looked almost like a small drop of water. But when he stepped closer, it disappeared. He shook his head slightly. Perhaps it was just the light. Still, something in his heart told him this quiet garden was becoming something more than a place of prayer. Because the next week, people would begin traveling from other parts of Detroit. And soon, the story of the Virgin Mary of Detroit helping the sick would spread far beyond the neighborhood. But the greatest moment of all had not happened yet. Because one night, someone would arrive at the church who had nearly lost all hope of living at all. By the middle of October, the small garden behind St. Gabriel's Church in Detroit had changed in a way Father Michael never expected. Every day, more people arrived. Some walked slowly with canes. Some came in wheelchairs. Some arrived holding the hands of family members who were helping them take careful steps across the narrow stone path leading toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. The garden that had once been quiet was now filled with whispers of prayer. Candles appeared beside the flower beds. People left small notes, photographs, and rosaries near the base of the statue. Some visitors simply sat on the wooden bench in silence. Others knelt beside the flowers and prayed with tears in their eyes. Father Michael watched all of it with a mixture of humility and concern. He often reminded visitors that the church did not promise miracles. Prayer gives strength, he would say gently. But healing comes in many different ways. Still, he couldn't deny the stories he kept hearing. One man said the pain in his back had disappeared for several hours after praying in the garden. A woman battling cancer said the terrible anxiety that kept her awake every night had suddenly lifted. Another visitor claimed his breathing had become easier after touching the stone base of the statue. None of it could be explained easily. Yet something about the garden continued to draw people there. Then one evening something happened that no one at St. Gabriel's would ever forget. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Father Michael heard the sound of sirens. An ambulance stopped in front of the church. Two paramedics carefully helped a young woman out of the back. She looked weak and pale, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her name was Elena Ramirez. Elena was only 32 years old. For months, she had been battling a severe heart condition that doctors were struggling to control. Her heart rhythm was unstable, and she had already been rushed to the hospital several times that year. Her brother walked beside the paramedics. "I know this sounds strange," he said nervously to Father Michael, "but she asked us to bring her here." Father Michael nodded calmly. "You're welcome." The paramedics helped Elena into the courtyard garden. The night air was cool, and the church lights cast a soft glow across the flowers and the pale statue standing quietly among them. Elena looked at the statue for a long moment. Her breathing sounded uneven. "I don't want to die yet," she whispered softly. Her brother held her hand. "You're not going to," he said quickly, though his voice carried fear. The paramedics stepped back respectfully while Elena slowly walked forward. Each step seemed difficult. When she reached the statue, she placed one trembling hand on the cold stone base. For several seconds, she closed her eyes. The garden was completely silent. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to fade. Father Michael stood nearby watching carefully. Then Elena whispered something so quietly that only the people closest to her could hear. "Mary, please help me live." At that exact moment, something unexpected happened. Elena suddenly inhaled deeply. Her body stiffened slightly, and she placed her other hand on her chest. Her brother looked terrified. "Elena." She opened her eyes slowly. Her breathing had changed. The irregular rhythm that had made each breath shaky now seemed steadier. The paramedics stepped closer immediately. One of them checked her pulse. He looked confused. "Her heart rate just stabilized," he said quietly. The other paramedic checked again to be sure. "That's unusual." Elena looked up at the statue again. Tears filled her eyes. "I feel calmer," she whispered. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Father Michael stepped closer. "Sometimes," he said gently, "peace can be powerful medicine." The paramedics decided to take Elena back to the hospital for observation. Before leaving, she looked once more at the statue of the Virgin Mary. "Thank you," she whispered. The ambulance drove away a few minutes later. Father Michael remained alone in the courtyard garden. The night had grown quiet again. He walked slowly toward the statue. The stone face looked exactly as it always had. Yet something about the moment felt extraordinary. He looked up at the sky above Detroit. Perhaps it had been coincidence. Perhaps Elena's body had simply stabilized at the right moment. Or perhaps something else had happened in that quiet garden. Within days, the story of the ambulance and the woman whose heart suddenly calmed would spread through the city. And soon people across Detroit would begin calling the statue something new. They would call her the Virgin Mary who heals the sick. But the most remarkable moment of all was still waiting. Because soon, a discovery would be made in the garden that even the doctors and scientists could not explain. Within a few weeks, the quiet courtyard behind St. Gabriel's Church had become one of the most talked about places in Detroit. People came from every part of the city. Some arrived early in the morning before sunrise. Others came late in the evening when the church lights illuminated the small garden and the pale stone statue of the Virgin Mary standing among the flowers. Many of the visitors were sick. Some walked slowly with the help of canes. Others came in wheelchairs or supported by family members. Yet despite their pain, something strange seemed to happen when they entered the courtyard. The atmosphere felt peaceful, almost unusually calm. People spoke quietly there, as if they had stepped into a place where the noise of the city could not reach them. Father Michael tried to keep things simple. He reminded visitors that the statue itself was only stone. "What matters," he often said, "is prayer, faith, and hope." But the stories continued to grow. A man who had suffered severe migraines for years said the headaches disappeared after he prayed beside the statue. A woman undergoing cancer treatments said she finally slept peacefully for the first time in months after visiting the garden. Another visitor who struggled with severe anxiety said the moment he sat on the bench beside the statue, a strange calmness filled his mind. Doctors could not explain these things. Some believed it was simply the power of belief. Others said the peaceful garden helped people relax enough for their bodies to recover. Still, the visitors kept coming. Soon local reporters arrived. Television cameras appeared outside the church. News articles began calling the statue the Virgin Mary of Detroit. Father Michael felt uncomfortable with the attention, but he continued welcoming everyone who came. "Whether you believe in miracles or not," he told reporters, People who arrive here leave with hope, and hope can heal more than we understand. One evening near the end of October, the courtyard was filled with visitors once again. Candles flickered beside the flower beds. Several elderly women were praying quietly on the benches. A man in a wheelchair spoke softly with his daughter. Near the statue stood Elena Ramirez, the young woman who had arrived weeks earlier in the ambulance. She had returned to thank the people who had helped her that night. Her doctors had recently confirmed that her heart rhythm had remained stable ever since. While the illness had not disappeared completely, the dangerous episodes had stopped. Elena slowly approached the statue again. The golden evening light reflected across the stone face. For a moment, she simply stood there silently. Then she placed her hand on the base of the statue once more. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind her, the courtyard remained peaceful. People sat together, talking quietly. Some were still sick. Some were still struggling. But none of them looked completely hopeless anymore. Father Michael watched the scene from the church steps. He realized something important. Maybe the greatest miracle in the garden was not physical healing. Maybe it was something even more powerful. People who arrived feeling alone were leaving with hope. They talked to one another. They shared their stories. They comforted strangers who were facing the same fears. The small garden had become a place where suffering people supported each other. As the sun began to disappear behind the Detroit skyline, the statue of the Virgin Mary glowed softly in the last light of the day. Father Michael walked slowly toward it. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint reflection on the statue's cheek again, just like the evening weeks earlier. It could have been a drop of water, or simply the light. He smiled quietly, because whether it was a miracle or not, something beautiful had happened in that small garden. A place once forgotten had become a place of healing, comfort, and faith. And long after the news cameras left and the crowds grew smaller again, people would still come to St. Gabriel's garden. They would sit beside the flowers. They would pray beside the statue. And many of them would leave believing that somewhere in that quiet corner of Detroit, the Virgin Mary was still watching over the sick.